Hi everyone, this is the first part of my two-part sequence on aggregate supply and aggregate demand. I decided to record this chapter after discussing monetary policy in the previous face-to-face meeting so that you can have a complete picture of how monetary policy and fiscal policy work hand in hand to either boost the economy or prevent it from overheating. I encourage you to email me or talk to me before or after class if you have any questions on this material. Recall from Chapter 2 on supply and demand that demand is all about consumer behavior. So with aggregate demand, what we're going to do is analyze the consumption portion of the macroeconomy. And so aggregate demand is based on the 5 factors that go into GDP: household consumption, business investment, government expenditures, exports, and imports. Although we'll be talking briefly about net exports, we'll take a deeper dive into international trade in our next face-to-face class. As with the traditional demand curve, price and quantity are inversely related. With this macro approach, what we'll say is that the overall price level, which we have previously used to study inflation, will be negatively correlated with output, or GDP. More on that in a second. But first, let's take a look at the aggregate demand curve. Recall that the traditional demand curve had price on the y-axis and quantity on the x-axis. Here, we still have price on the y-axis, but an increase in price will be referred to as inflation, whereas a decrease in price will be referred to as deflation. Instead of having Q represent quantity on the x-axis, we now have Y to represent macroeconomic output, or GDP. So what's the intuition behind the downward sloping aggregate demand, or AD curve? We learned back in Chapter 2 that if prices go up, then quantity demanded goes down. In other words, when products become more expensive, consumers buy less of it. Similarly, when all products become more expensive, consumer spending will fall. Likewise, business investment will decrease when price levels increase. If it costs more to buy machinery or build a new factory, then firms will need larger loans to finance these purchases. However, this will increase the demand for loans in our money graph at the end of the previous chapter, which we learned will lead to an increase in interest rates. Higher interest rates will further discourage firms from spending money to upgrade their facilities or innovate their production process. Finally, an increase in the price of U.S. products makes our goods and services relatively more expensive compared to foreign products. As such, exports will fall since foreign countries will want to buy less of the relatively expensive American products, and imports will rise since we will want to buy more of the relatively cheaper foreign products. The decrease in exports and increase in imports will ultimately lead to a decrease in net exports. Notice that government spending is not listed on this slide. We'll talk more about the role of government spending on aggregate demand in a couple slides. As with the traditional demand curve back in Chapter 2, we'll also want to consider shifts to the aggregate demand curve. We have 2 demand shifters. One is monetary policy, which relates to the material we talked about in the last face-to-face meeting, and the second demand shifter is fiscal policy, which is when we'll come back to talking about government spending. We'll go through each of these in turn. Recall from the previous chapter that expansionary monetary policy occurs when the Fed either buys bonds or decreases interest rates, whereas contractionary monetary policy happens when the Fed either sells bonds or increases interest rates. As far as the supply and demand of money is concerned, we had discussed how expansionary monetary policy means that the money supply increases so that interest rates decrease and M1, or the monetary value of currency in checking accounts, increases. This will incentivize consumers and businesses to take out loans and ultimately increase spending. On the other hand, contractionary monetary policy means that the money supply decreases so that interest rates increase and M1 decreases. This will make it less likely for consumers and businesses to take out loans and will ultimately decrease spending. So expansionary monetary policy effectively increases spending by households and businesses, which means that the aggregate demand curve will shift to the right, whereas contractionary monetary policy effectively decreases spending by households and businesses, which means that the aggregate demand curve will shift to the left. Since government spending is one of the components to GDP, the federal government can either increase its size to boost the economy or shrink to put the brakes on a potentially overheating economy. Government spending can be altered in one of 2 ways: government purchases and taxes. First, an increase in government spending will increase GDP and therefore shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. Conversely, a decrease in government spending will decrease GDP and therefore shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. Furthermore, an increase in taxes will lower the amount of spending by consumers and businesses, so a higher tax rate will shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. Conversely, a decrease in taxes will encourage more spending by consumers and businesses, so a lower tax rate will shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. This graph illustrates a shift in the AD curve. An increase in aggregate demand means that the AD curve shifts to the right, such as going from AD1 to AD2. Or a decrease in aggregate demand means that the AD curve shifts to the left, such as going from AD2 to AD1. Again, the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right when the Fed engages in expansionary monetary policy or when the federal government increases government spending. On the other hand, the aggregate demand curve shifts to the left when the Fed engages in contractionary monetary policy or when the federal government decreases government spending. Recall from the chapter on production and cost that we had to differentiate between the short run and the long run. Back then, we said that the difference was that in the short run, labor was variable and capital is fixed, whereas both labor and capital are variable in the long run. Here, aggregate supply will represent production in the United States, so we will need to differentiate between short-run aggregate supply and long-run aggregate supply. We'll actually start with the long-run perspective on production. Macroeconomists believe that if the economy is operating to its full potential, then the optimal amount of GDP is referred to as potential GDP. This would occur when unemployment is at the full employment level, which most macroeconomists believe to be around 5%, and all of the physical capital is operating at their maximum levels. In other words, potential GDP is a target GDP amount under ideal conditions. Just like with money supply, this target amount is just a number, so the long-run aggregate supply, or SAS curve, will be illustrated as a vertical line. The analysis on short-run production is inspired by the work of John Maynard Keynes, who was a prominent macroeconomist during the Great Depression. His Keynesian model suggests that at really low values of GDP, like during the Great Depression, production can increase with little to no effect on prices. This means that unemployment is so high when the economy is doing terribly that companies can get away with paying desperate workers a very low wage. As such, the short-run aggregate supply, or SAS curve, will start out horizontal to reflect no change in the price level when GDP is low. However, when the economy becomes strong enough that unemployment is relatively low, in order to produce more, companies will have to increase their pay to hire more workers. However, the higher labor cost will be passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices. As such, the short-run aggregate supply curve eventually becomes upward sloping, just like our traditional supply curve. The aggregate supply curve can shift depending on two factors: labor and capital inputs, as well as productivity. First, an increase in the number of inputs, whether that's due to hiring more workers or buying more machines, will increase production and therefore shift the aggregate supply curve to the right. Conversely, a decrease in the number of workers or selling of machines will decrease production and therefore shift the aggregate supply curve to the left. Similarly, an increase in productivity, which is a measure of the efficiency of production, will increase production and shift the aggregate supply curve to the right. Conversely, a decrease in productivity will decrease production and shift the aggregate supply curve to the left. So what does the graph look like when you combine both aggregate supply and aggregate demand? Well, you'll have to watch the next video to see how we can apply the ASAD model to explain 3 important time periods in U.S. economic history. Feel free to email me with any questions that you have.